I was never a superstitious man. Stories about Christmas ghosts or strange holiday creatures were just tales people told to keep the kids entertained during the dark winter months. But after that Christmas Eve in 1997, I can't hear a carol or see a snowflake without feeling a cold dread crawl up my spine. It was the year I moved back to my hometown, Crenshaw, Vermont, a small town where the snow always seemed to fall thicker and the nights stretched longer. My mom had passed away in August, and I'd inherited the old family house at the edge of the woods. It was just me and my dog, Max, a scruffy mutt with one ear perked up, like he was always listening for trouble. The night started like any other Christmas Eve. Snow was piling up on the windowsills, and the old grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock p.m. as I finished hanging a few last ornaments on the scrawny tree I'd dragged in from the yard. Max lay curled up by the fireplace, his tail thumping every time the flames crackled. And then I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor dropping by with cookies or a caroler braving the cold. No, this was deliberate, measured, like someone was tapping just enough to let me know they were there without drawing too much attention. I froze for a moment, staring at the door. Who'd be out in a snowstorm this late? "Stay," I whispered to Max, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to reassure more, him or me. When I opened the door, the night outside was still. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, covering the front porch in a pristine white blanket. But there was no one there, just the wind whistling through the trees. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe it was just my imagination or the wind playing tricks on the old wood. But as I turned to close the door, I noticed something strange. Footprints. Small, bare footprints, leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. I should have shut the door and bolted it, but curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight and my coat, I whistled for Max, who hesitated before padding over, his ears flat against his head. We followed the tracks into the woods. They weaved between the trees, impossibly precise, as though whoever made them was perfectly familiar with the terrain. And then, about 50 yards in, they stopped. Just like that, no drag marks, no signs of turning back, just a single pair of footprints ending in the middle of nowhere. Max growled low in his throat, and that's when I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. It looked like a child, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a long scarf trailing in the snow. "Hey, kid," I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you lost?" The child didn't move, didn't speak, and then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. There was nothing there. No tracks, no movement. Just the endless expanse of snow-covered trees. When I turned back, the child was gone. By the time I got back to the house, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. Max wouldn't stop pacing, growling at the windows like he could see something I couldn't. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the cold and the dark had gotten to me. But then the knocking started again. This time, it came from the window. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was, the same child, staring at me through the frost-covered glass. Its eyes were black pits, bottomless and gleaming like oil. It didn't knock this time. It pressed its hand against the glass, and I swear I saw the frost begin to spread, spiderwebbing out like it was trying to reach me. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table, and Max barked like a dog possessed. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the child was inside. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes Max barking, the child's laugh echoing in my ears, and the overwhelming scent of pine and decay. When I came to, it was morning. The house was empty, and Max was gone. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle. Just a single ornament hanging on the tree that I didn't recognize, a small, hand-carved figure of a child in a scarf, its face blank and featureless. Every year since, I've heard that same knock on Christmas Eve. I never answer it anymore, but sometimes late at night, I still hear Max barking, his voice muffled by the wind. And every Christmas morning, there's a new ornament on the tree. I'll admit, I was never much of a Christmas guy. Not since my dad passed away on Christmas Eve when I was 8. My mom and I tried to keep the traditions alive, but the holidays always felt hollow after that. By the time I hit 30, I'd started treating December 25th like any other day. So, when my buddy Nate asked me to house sit for him over the holidays, I jumped at the chance to get away. His place wasn't much, a small, 2-story cabin tucked deep in the woods outside Anchorage, Alaska, but it was quiet, secluded. Exactly what I needed to escape the forced cheer and jingling bells of the season. The first couple of days were uneventful. The snow piled up outside, and the wood stove kept the cabin cozy enough. I spent most of my time reading or listening to music, Max Richter instead of Mariah Carey. On Christmas Eve, though, something shifted. It started with the singing. At first, I thought it was the wind. A low, rhythmic hum that seemed to rise and fall, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But as the hours ticked by, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. Soft, eerie voices, harmonizing in a language I didn't recognize. I told myself it was nothing, probably a trick of the wind through the trees, or maybe a pack of coyotes yipping in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberate, that it was meant for me. By midnight, the voices were louder, closer. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling my coat tight against the bitter cold. The forest was silent, the snow absorbing every sound except for that strange, haunting melody. My breath fogged in the air as I scanned the tree line, but I didn't see anyone. And yet, the voices seemed to surround me, weaving in and out of the shadows like smoke. That's when I saw them. They were standing just beyond the edge of the porch light, half hidden by the snow-laden branches. Figures cloaked in white, their faces obscured by the hoods of their robes. There were at least a dozen of them, perfectly still, their heads tilted slightly as if they were listening to something only they could hear. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, humming that same eerie tune, their voices weaving together in a way that made my stomach churn. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to step closer. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Something they wanted me to do. As I descended the steps, the humming stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it made my ears ring. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements smooth and unnatural, like it was gliding over the snow. As it approached, I saw that it wasn't wearing a robe. The fabric was skin pale, almost translucent, with veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. Its face? God, I'll never forget its face. There were no eyes, no nose, just a wide, lipless mouth that stretched into an unnatural grin. I stumbled back, slipping on the icy steps, and scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the line crackled with static. Before I could try again, a soft knock echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deliberate, almost polite, but it sent a wave of dread washing over me. Go away. I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the humming started again, louder this time, as if the voices were inside the cabin. The air grew thick, heavy, and I felt a pressure building in my ears. I stumbled toward the door, intending to make a run for it, but when I opened it, the porch was empty. The figures were gone, but the snow was covered in footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching a fire poker like it would do any good. The voices never stopped, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining weakly through the clouds, and the voices were gone. I thought it was over until I stepped outside. The footprints were still there, but now they led away from the cabin, weaving through the trees in a strange, spiraling pattern. At the center of the spiral, half buried in the snow, was a single object, a Christmas ornament. It was made of glass, delicate and intricately detailed. Inside was a miniature cabin, just like Nate's. And inside the tiny cabin were tiny figures, standing perfectly still. 13 of them. I packed up and left that day, leaving Nate a hasty voicemail about an emergency. I never explained what happened, and I haven't been back to Alaska since. Sometimes, though, late at night, I think I hear that humming. And every Christmas, without fail, I find a new ornament on my tree. The blizzard hit our little town of Huxley, Maine, on the evening of December 23, 1986. The kind of storm that makes you hunker down, pile blankets by the fire, and hope your generator doesn't conk out before morning. I was 13 at the time, a lanky kid with a busket and a perpetual sniffle from the cold. My older brother, Daniel, was 17, bigger, meaner, and always looking for ways to torment me. That night, Mom and Dad were stuck in Portland, snowed in after a last-minute shopping trip, leaving me and Daniel home alone. "Don't do anything stupid," Mom had said over the crackling phone line before it cut out. Daniel's grin was all teeth. Define stupid. We lived in an old farmhouse on the edge of town, surrounded by acres of pine forest that seemed endless in the dark. The power went out around 8 o'clock p.m., plunging the house into an eerie silence, broken only by the howling wind. Daniel lit a few candles and declared himself king of the castle, ordering me to make peanut butter sandwiches while he rifled through Dad's liquor cabinet. "Don't be a wuss, Andy," he said, tossing me a flashlight. "It's just a little snow. We'll survive." I hated when he called me that, wuss, but I kept my mouth shut. An hour later, we were sitting by the fire, Daniel sipping whiskey out of a coffee mug, when we heard it. A thud. It came from outside near the barn. We looked at each other, his smirk fading just a little. "You hear that?" I whispered. Daniel shrugged, but he was trying too hard to look nonchalant. Probably just snow falling off the roof. Then came another thud, louder this time. And then a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl, like an animal, but not quite. "Stay here," Daniel said, grabbing Dad's flashlight and slipping into his boots. "Don't go out there." I hissed, clutching the blanket around my shoulders. "Relax, wuss. I'll be back in 2 minutes." I watched him step into the storm, his silhouette swallowed by the swirling snow. The door banged shut behind him, leaving me alone with the dim light of the fire and the oppressive quiet of the house. Minutes passed, then 5, then 10. "Daniel," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed my own flashlight and cracked the door open. The wind screamed, and snow blasted my face, but I stepped outside, my heart hammering in my chest. Daniel, the barn loomed ahead, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I made my way toward it, my boots crunching in the snow, and that's when I saw the first streak of red. It was smeared across the ground, vivid against the white, leading into the barn. My stomach churned as I followed it, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. Inside, the barn was dark, the air thick with the smell of hay and something metallic. "Daniel," I whispered. The beam of my flashlight caught something in the corner of Daniel's boot, half buried in the straw. And then I saw it. Hanging from the rafters was a figure wrapped in chains, its body twisted and grotesque. At first, I thought it was Daniel, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't human. Its skin was gray and mottled, its face elongated like a deer's skull, with antlers curling grotesquely from its head. Its eyes were hollow sockets, glowing faintly red, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. It grinned at me, swaying slightly as the chains creaked. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to the house, but I slammed the door behind me and bolted it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Daniel," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Where are you?" The wind howled louder, and then I heard a deep, rasping voice that seemed to echo from all around me. "Bad children," it hissed. "Bad children don't get gifts." The front door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. The windows rattled, and I heard the faint jingle of bells, though it wasn't cheerful. It was slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I hid under the kitchen table, clutching a carving knife, my eyes squeezed shut. The pounding stopped. For a long time, there was silence. Then, faintly, I heard the crunch of boots in the snow, moving away from the house. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the storm had calmed, and the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I found Daniel's flashlight near the barn, but there was no sign of him. Just more streaks of red, leading deep into the woods. The police said it was a bear attack, though no one could explain the tracks that looked like hooves. They never found Daniel. Every Christmas since, I've heard the sound of those bells. And every year, I leave a gift outside, hoping it'll be enough to keep whatever it was from coming back. Christmas was supposed to be simple that year. Just me, my husband Mark, and our 6-year-old daughter Ellie. Nothing big, nothing complicated. After the year, we'd had Mark losing his job, my mom passing away in July. We needed a quiet holiday. We were renting a small, drafty house in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place with single-pane windows and a furnace that worked half the time. It was all we could afford, but Ellie didn't seem to mind. "This house is magic," she told me one night as we decorated the tree. "Why's that, sweetie?" She grinned, her little hands clutching a glittery ornament. "Because Santa knows where to find it. He knows everything." The snow started falling around noon on Christmas Eve, thick flakes piling up fast. By the time the sun set, the world outside was a blinding sea of white. Mark and I were watching TV in the living room, trying to ignore the creeping chill in the air. Ellie was already in bed, tucked under a pile of blankets with her favorite stuffed bear. Around 10 o'clock p.m., Mark got up to throw another log on the fire. That's when we heard it. A knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a polite tap, just enough to get our attention. Mark frowned. Who the hell would be out in this weather? "I don't know," I said, my stomach twisting. "Maybe a neighbor?" We hadn't met any of the neighbors, but someone could have gotten stuck in the snow. It wasn't impossible. Mark grabbed his coat and opened the door. The wind howled, scattering snow into the entryway, but there was no one there. He leaned out, shining his flashlight across the yard. Still nothing. "Probably just the wind," he said, shutting the door with a shrug. But something about it didn't sit right with me. An hour later, we heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. Mark froze, the poker from the fireplace still in his hand. "I'll check the back door," he said, his voice low. He was gone for less than 2 minutes, but when he came back, his face was pale. "There's something on the porch," he whispered. "What is it?" He didn't answer, just motioned for me to follow him. I threw on my coat and stepped out into the cold. At first, I didn't see anything, just the swirling snow and the glow of our Christmas lights. Then I looked down. Sitting on the porch, perfectly centered, was a box. It was wrapped in red paper, tied with a green ribbon, and looked exactly like the kind of gift you'd find under the tree. Except it wasn't ours. Mark nudged it with his foot, but nothing happened. "You think someone left it for us?" I asked, though the words felt ridiculous as soon as they left my mouth. Maybe he picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was surprisingly light, and there was no tag or name. "We should open it," he said, carrying it inside. Something about that box made my skin crawl. I tried to convince Mark to leave it alone, but he just laughed. What's the worst it could be? A fruit cake? He ripped off the paper, revealing a plain wooden box with a sliding lid. Inside was a single item, a glass snow globe. It was beautiful, I'll admit that. The base was carved with tiny, intricate designed snowflakes, stars, and little houses. Inside the globe was a perfect miniature of our rental house, complete with the Christmas lights we'd strung along the roof. "That's weird," Mark muttered, turning it over in his hands. I stared at it, a cold knot forming in my chest. "How does it look exactly like our house?" Mark didn't answer. Because inside the globe, something was moving. At first, I thought it was just the glitter swirling in the water, but it wasn't. Tiny figures were walking through the snow around the miniature house. One of them was holding something, a box wrapped in red paper. "Turn it over," I whispered. Mark flipped the globe upside down, revealing a metal plaque on the base. "The gift exchange. What does that mean?" I asked, but Mark didn't respond. He was staring at the globe, his face pale. "Ellie," he whispered. My heart sank. I grabbed the globe from his hands and stared inside. The tiny figures were at the door now, 3 of them, their heads tilted in that unnatural way that made my stomach churn. And inside the house, there was Ellie. She was standing in the living room, clutching her stuffed bear, staring at the front door. We ran upstairs, but Ellie's bed was empty. The blankets were still warm, her bear lying on the floor, but she was gone. "Ellie," I screamed, running from room to room, but there was no sign of her. Mark stood frozen at the top of the stairs, the snow globe clutched in his hands. "She's in there," he whispered. "What are you talking about?" He held the globe up to the light, and I saw her again. Ellie, standing in the tiny house, her face pressed to the glass. And behind her, the figures were coming closer. We tried everything. Smashing the globe didn't work, it was unbreakable. Mark even tried burning it, but the flames wouldn't touch it. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the globe was gone. No footprints, no sign of Ellie. Just an empty bed and a hollow ache that nothing could fill. We filed a police report, but they didn't find anything. The only clue was a single package left on the porch that morning. A box wrapped in red paper, tied with a green ribbon. We didn't open it. We moved out a week later, but every Christmas Eve, without fail, there's a knock at the door. We don't answer it, and we never will. If you've ever spent a Christmas in White Hollow, Vermont, You've probably heard of the McAllister Massacre. That's what the papers called it anyway. The cops tried to hush it up, but in a town that's small, secrets don't last. I know because I lived 3 houses down from the McAllisters, and I was there the night it happened. White Hollow was a postcard kind of town, quaint, snow-covered streets, a Christmas tree in the town square, carolers singing outside the general store. My family had just moved there that December. My dad took a job teaching at the high school, and my mom was busy trying to make our rental house feel like home. I was 16, full of teenage cynicism and itching to get out of that tiny town. But Christmas was a big deal in White Hollow. People went all-out lights, decorations, the works. The McAllister house, in particular, was the crown jewel of the neighborhood. It was an old Victorian 3 stories tall, with a turret that looked like something out of a haunted house movie. Every year, they turned it into a Christmas wonderland. Thousands of lights, animatronic reindeer, and a life-sized Santa on the porch. People came from all over to see it. But that year, something was off. The decorations went up as usual, but there was something different about them. The lights were brighter, almost too bright, like they hurt your eyes if you looked at them too long. The Santa on the porch didn't wave cheerfully like he used to. He just stood there, still and silent, staring at the street. And the music. They always played Christmas carols on an outdoor speaker, but this year, the songs were warped, like a record player running too slow. Silent Night dragged on in a deep, distorted hum that made my skin crawl. On Christmas Eve, the snow started falling hard. Most of the neighbors were home, wrapping presents or sipping eggnog by the fire. I was in my room, scrolling through the mixtapes my friends had sent me, when I heard the first scream. It was faint, muffled by the wind, but enough to make me sit up. Then came another scream. Louder, sharper. I ran to my window and looked down the street. The McAllister house was glowing like a beacon, the lights pulsing in time with the music, and the front door was wide open. I threw on my boots and coat and ran outside, slipping on the icy sidewalk. By the time I got to their yard, a few other neighbors had gathered, huddled together and whispering. "Did you hear that?" One of them asked. "Sounded like Mrs. McAllister," said another. The house loomed in front of us, the windows glowing red and green. I could hear the music clearer now, "O Come All Ye Faithful," but slowed to a nightmarish crawl. "Someone should check," I said, my breath fogging in the cold. The others looked at me like I just suggested jumping into a lion's cage. "No way," said Mr. Henderson, who lived across the street. "That family's." Strange, he wasn't wrong. The McAllisters kept to themselves. Mr. McAllister worked at the post office, and Mrs. McAllister baked pies for church functions, but their 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, were quiet, almost unnervingly so. But this was different. This wasn't just weird. This was wrong. I stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching under my boots. The Santa figure stood motionless, its painted eyes fixed on me. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the house was chaos. The Christmas tree was toppled over, ornaments shattered across the floor. The walls were covered in streaks of something dark and sticky. And the music, it wasn't coming from a speaker. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. That's when I saw the first body. It was one of the McAllister boys, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. His hands were clawed, as if he'd been trying to fend off something that wasn't there. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. And then I heard it, a low, rasping voice coming from the living room. "Silent Night. Holy night. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of that house, but my feet wouldn't move. The voice grew louder, echoing off the walls. All is calm. All is bright. I crept toward the living room, my heart hammering in my chest. There, in the center of the room, stood the McAllister family. Mr. and Mrs. McAllister, the two boys, and the little girl. They were standing perfectly still, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their mouths moving in unison as they sang. But their eyes were gone. Just empty sockets, black and bottomless. And in the corner of the room, hunched over the toppled Christmas tree, was something I can't even begin to describe. It was tall, its limbs twisted and angular, like a marionette controlled by a madman. Its face was shrouded in shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, red and hungry. It turned toward me, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. "Merry Christmas," it hissed. I don't remember running home. I don't remember how I got back to my room or how long I sat there, shaking and staring at the wall. By morning, the McAllister house was gone. Not just empty gone. The lot was bare, as if it had never been there in the first place. The police didn't believe me. The neighbors didn't want to talk about it. But every Christmas Eve, when the snow starts to fall, I hear the faint strains of Silent Night on the wind, and I know it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps, tucked away at the end of a winding country road surrounded by pines. The sign above the shop door read, "Finley's Fine Toys," written in looping gold letters. My dad spotted it first. We were driving home from my grandparents' house on Christmas Eve when he slammed on the brakes. "Would you look at that?" he said, pointing to the little shop glowing in the twilight. "How about we grab one last gift for the kiddo?" I was 7, still young enough to believe in Santa, but old enough to notice when my parents were stressed. That year had been tight, Dad between jobs, Mom working extra shifts at the hospital. The thought of a surprise Christmas gift must have felt like a way to make the holiday special. The shop looked like it had been plucked from a snow globe. Frosted windows, candy canes lining the path, and a wreath on the door so perfect it looked fake. "Go pick something, champ," Dad said, ruffling my hair. "Anything you want inside." The air was warm and smelled like cinnamon. Shelves lined every inch of the walls, packed with wooden toys, tin soldiers, and hand-sewn dolls. A model train chugged along a track that circled the ceiling, puffing tiny clouds of steam. Behind the counter stood an old man, thin and weary, with glasses perched on the tip of his nose. His face was wrinkled like crumpled parchment, but his eyes were sharp and bright. "Welcome," he said, his voice cheerful but oddly hollow. "Finley's the name, and you must be my final customers of the season." My parents smiled politely, but I could tell they were uneasy. There was something off about the shop. The way the shadows didn't quite match the flickering candles, or how the music playing from the gramophone seemed just a bit too slow. Still, I was mesmerized. While my parents browsed the shelves, I wandered to the back of the shop, where a single toy stood on a pedestal. It was a marionette, a little wooden boy with bright blue eyes and a painted smile. Its strings were impossibly fine, almost invisible, and they hung from a gleaming brass crossbar. I couldn't take my eyes off it. "You like him?" Finley's voice startled me, and I jumped. He chuckled, stepping closer. "That one's special. I call him Jasper. He's cool," I said, though something about the marionette made my stomach twist. "He's more than cool, my boy. Jasper is one of a kind. He can dance, talk, even keep you company when you're lonely." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't look away. "Would you like to take him home?" Finley asked, his voice low and coaxing. I hesitated. Before I could answer, my dad called out, "You find something, buddy?" I looked at Finley, then at the marionette. "Yes," I said. "I want him." The drive home was quiet, the marionette sitting in my lap like a passenger. Mom didn't like it. "That thing gives me the creeps," she muttered. "It's just a toy," Dad said, though he didn't sound convinced. That night, I placed Jasper on a chair by the Christmas tree, his strings draped neatly over the armrest. "Good night," I whispered, feeling silly for talking to a toy. I turned off the lights and went to bed. At 2:14 a.m., I woke up. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. But something felt wrong. I crept out of bed, padding softly down the stairs. The Christmas tree lights were still on, casting soft, colorful shadows across the living room. And Jasper was gone. The chair where I'd left him was empty, his strings dangling limply over the edge. "Jasper," I whispered, my voice trembling. A faint creak echoed from the hallway. I turned, and there he was, standing upright in the doorway. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you move?" I stammered, though I knew how ridiculous it sounded. His head tilted to one side, the painted smile on his face seeming wider now. And then he took a step forward. I screamed, and the lights in the house flickered. My parents came running, their faces pale and confused. "What's wrong?" Mom asked, kneeling in front of me. I pointed to the doorway, but Jasper was back in the chair, his strings neatly coiled. "He moved," I whispered. He walked, my dad sighed, rubbing his face. "You had a bad dream, bud. Come on, let's get you back to bed." I didn't argue. But as my dad carried me up the stairs, I looked back over his shoulder. Jasper's head had turned, and his blue eyes were watching me. The next morning, Christmas Day, was a blur. The house felt colder, the sunlight weaker. I refused to go near Jasper, but my parents didn't seem to notice anything strange. After breakfast, Dad suggested we open presents. "Why don't you grab the first one?" he said, gesturing to the pile under the tree. I nodded reluctantly and reached for a box wrapped in bright red paper. As I unwrapped it, a chill ran down my spine. Inside was a smaller marionette, identical to Jasper in every way. "Who's it from?" Mom asked, frowning. There was no tag, no name. Just a single slip of paper with a message scrawled in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. One for everyone in the family. That night, I threw Jasper into the fireplace. The flames roared, but he didn't burn. Instead, he twisted and writhed, his painted smile curling into a sneer. "You can't get rid of me," he hissed, his voice high and sharp. The fire sputtered out, leaving only smoke and ash. And in the morning, Jasper was back on the chair, his strings perfectly arranged. We moved out of that house by New Year's. Left everything behind, even the Christmas tree. But it didn't matter. Every year, without fail, a box shows up on our doorstep. Inside is another marionette, smiling and waiting. They called it the Christmas Snatcher. Every year, in the weeks leading up to Christmas, someone disappeared. Always in the same area, downtown Fairhaven, Massachusetts. The cops tried to keep it quiet, but people talked. How could they not? It wasn't just the disappearances that freaked everyone out. It was what they left behind. A red scarf, not folded neatly on the ground or draped over a fence. No, it was always tied to something: a lamppost, a door handle, a tree branch, like a calling card. Growing up in Fairhaven, it was the kind of thing you joked about, but didn't really believe. Sure, it was creepy, but everyone thought it was just an urban legend, something to scare kids into behaving during the holidays. At least, that's what I thought. Until last Christmas. I was 16, old enough to roll my eyes at holiday traditions, but not too old to sneak out to the annual Christmas market. It was one of the few good things about Fairhaven rows of wooden stalls lit up with fairy lights, selling everything from handmade ornaments to hot cider. My best friend, Emma, and I had made a tradition of it. We'd spend hours wandering around, laughing at the cheesy carolers and taking selfies in front of the giant tree. That night, the market was packed. Families with strollers, couples holding hands, kids with sticky faces clutching cotton candy. The air was cold, but the kind of cold that felt festive, not miserable. We were by the candy stall when Emma noticed him. "Don't look now," she said, nudging me, "but Creepy Claus is staring at you." I turned, pretending to adjust my scarf, and spotted him. He was tall and thin, with a long, ratty coat and a Santa hat that looked like it had been dragged through a gutter. His face was pale, almost sickly, with sunken eyes and a scraggly white beard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching us. "Maybe he thinks we're on the naughty list," I joked, but my stomach churned. "Let's go," Emma said, grabbing my arm. We tried to lose ourselves in the crowd, darting between stalls and ducking behind groups of shoppers. But every time I glanced back, he was there, weaving through the sea of people like a shark. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Emma hissed, her breath visible in the icy air. We ducked into an alley between two stalls, the noise of the market fading behind us. "Let's just wait here for a minute," I said, my voice shaky. The alley was dark and narrow, lined with dumpsters and cardboard boxes. I pulled out my phone to text my mom, but the screen wouldn't light up. "No signal," I muttered, shaking it uselessly. Emma was about to reply when we heard a soft, scraping sound, like footsteps on gravel. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was just around the corner. Then he appeared. The man stepped into the alley, his face twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Lost girls?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "Leave us alone." Emma shouted, but it came out more like a plea than a command. He took a step closer, his hand reaching into his coat. I grabbed Emma's arm, ready to bolt, when I saw it. A red scarf. It was tied to a rusty pipe jutting out of the wall, fluttering gently in the breeze. My heart sank. "We need to go," I whispered, pulling Emma toward the other end of the alley. But the man moved faster than I expected, cutting us off with a speed that didn't match his frail appearance. "No one ever listens," he said, shaking his head. "It's always the same. They think it's just a story. What do you want?" I asked, my voice cracking. He smiled wider, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too pointed. "I'm just the deliveryman," he said. "But she'll be pleased with you." Emma whispered, clutching my arm. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out another red scarf. I don't remember much after that. Emma says I screamed, and maybe I did, but all I can recall is the sound of the scarf snapping in the wind and the way the shadows in the alley seemed to grow and twist, swallowing everything around us. When I woke up, it was morning. The market was gone, the stalls packed up, and the alley was empty. Emma was sitting next to me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "We have to go," she said, helping me to my feet. The scarf was gone. The police didn't believe us, of course. They said we must have been drinking or playing some kind of prank. But we knew the truth. Every Christmas since, I've seen them, the scarves. One tied to a lamppost outside my house, another hanging from a tree in the park. And every time, I hear the same whisper on the wind, she's watching. There's something about Christmas that makes people nostalgic. Warm lights, the smell of pine, the promise of miracles. For me, it's the opposite. Christmas reminds me of snow, and not the soft, peaceful kind that blankets the world in silence. No, I'm talking about the snow that crunches underfoot, hides things it shouldn't, and freezes blood before you even realize you're bleeding. It's the snow that killed my brother. I grew up in Grover's Mill, Vermont, a town so small you could drive through it in 5 minutes and miss it entirely. Winters there were brutal, but we loved them as kids. Snow meant no school, sledding down Deadman's Hill, and building snowmen. The Christmas I'm talking about was 1997. I was 12. My brother Sam was 9. That year, the snow came early and didn't stop. By mid-December, it was piled so high it covered the first floor windows. The whole town looked like something out of a postcard, but the truth was, people were scared. Animals had been disappearing. Pets, mostly dogs. Cats, but also livestock. We heard rumors at school about wolves or a bear wandering too close to town. But whatever it was, nobody had seen it. Just tracks in the snow, big ones, leading into the woods and never coming back out. My dad said it was nothing, just a hungry animal looking for food. But my mom started locking the doors, even in the middle of the day. The night it happened, Sam and I had been outside building a snowman. It was our third one that week, but this one was special. "Let's make him huge," Sam said, his cheeks red from the cold. Like taller than Dad, we worked on it for hours, rolling the base until it was almost as tall as me. The middle part was trickier, and by the time we got to the head, it was dark, and the streetlights were glowing orange through the falling snow. Sam wanted to give it a face, so he ran inside to grab a carrot and some rocks for eyes. I stayed outside, brushing snow off my gloves and admiring our work. That's when I saw the tracks. They were too big to be a dog's, and they led straight to the edge of the yard, stopping just shy of where we'd built the snowman. "Sam," I called, my voice shaky. He didn't answer. He came back a few minutes later, carrying the carrot in one hand and a handful of rocks in the other. "You okay?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. I pointed to the tracks, but by then, the snow had already filled them in. "Never mind," I said. "Let's finish up and go inside." We gave the snowman his face rocks for eyes and buttons, a crooked smile, the carrot for a nose. Sam wanted to add arms, but the branches we found were too short, so we left it as it was. Before we went inside, Sam turned back to look at it. "It looks like it's watching us," he said. I laughed, but I didn't like the way he said it. That night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I sat up and looked outside, I froze. The snowman was gone. All that was left was a mound of snow, flattened and scattered like something had stepped on it. The tracks were back, bigger and deeper this time, leading away from the yard and toward the woods. I ran to Sam's room, but his bed was empty. The window was open, snow blowing in across the sill. "Sam," I screamed, my voice cracking. My parents burst into the room a moment later, their faces pale and confused. "He's gone," I said, pointing to the window. Something took him. We searched the woods for hours, flashlights cutting through the darkness. My dad shouted Sam's name until his voice was hoarse, but there was no answer. The tracks led us deep into the trees, farther than we'd ever gone before. And then we found him. Or at least, we found what was left. He was sitting upright, his back against a tree, covered in frost. His face was pale, lips blue, eyes wide open. In his lap was a snowball, perfectly round, with 2 black rocks and a carrot shoved into it. It looked like a snowman's head. They said it was the cold that killed him, that he'd wandered off, gotten lost and frozen to death. But I knew better. Whatever left those tracks, whatever took him out of that room, it wasn't an animal. That night, I burned the remains of the snowman in the yard. The neighbors thought I'd gone crazy, but I didn't care. I just wanted it gone. But the snow doesn't forget. Every year on Christmas Eve, I see the tracks again. They lead up to my porch, stopping just outside the door. And every year, I hear the same sound, soft and faint, like the crunch of snow underfoot. It's waiting for me. We moved to Pine Hollow a week before Christmas. My dad got a job managing the hardware store, and my mom said it would be a fresh start. I didn't care what they called it. I hated leaving Chicago. Pine Hollow wasn't a town. It was a postcard someone forgot to mail. Just a bunch of houses buried in snow, with a main street that looked like it hadn't changed since 1950. But the weirdest thing, every house was covered in Christmas lights. Not the cute kind you see in movies. These were too much. Strings of lights dripping from roofs like melted candy, glowing reindeer staring from every lawn, and blinking Santas waving from windows. It's a tradition here, Mom said, pulling into our driveway. The whole town decorates. Isn't it festive? Festive wasn't the word I'd use. Our house came pre-decorated. The previous owners left everything behind, lights strung across the porch, a plastic Santa in the yard, and these creepy old candles shaped like angels lining the walkway. Mom loved it. I thought the angels looked like they were watching us. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The lights outside our window pulsed like a heartbeat, casting weird shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I heard something like footsteps crunching in the snow. I peeked through the curtain, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe a deer. Instead, I saw the lights. Not just ours, all the lights on the street were flickering, blinking on and off in a rhythm that felt wrong, like they were trying to say something. I was about to wake my parents when I saw him. A man standing in the middle of the street, wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't moving, just staring at our house. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. When I looked again, he was gone. The next morning, I told my dad about the man. Probably just a neighbor, he said, unpacking a box of dishes. Small towns are like that. Everyone's curious about the new folks. Mom wasn't worried either. Maybe it's part of the light festival, she said, brushing it off. You'll get used to it, but I didn't want to get used to it. That afternoon, I walked to the grocery store to grab a few things Mom needed for dinner. The cashier was a girl my age named Maddie. She had a nose ring and bright blue hair, a rebel in a town that looked like a Hallmark card. "You're the new kid, right?" she asked, scanning a can of cranberry sauce. "Yeah," I said. "What's with all the lights?" Her expression darkened. "It's the rule." "What rule?" "Every house has to decorate." "It's tradition, or what?" I asked, half joking. She didn't smile. "You don't want to know." That night, the lights started flickering again. This time, I wasn't alone. My dad noticed it too. "Probably just old wiring," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll check it out." He went outside, leaving me and Mom in the kitchen. After 10 minutes, I went to check on him. He was standing in the yard, staring at the plastic Santa. The flashlight was on the ground at his feet. "Dad," I called. He didn't answer. When I got closer, I saw his face. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to scream, but couldn't. "Dad, what's wrong?" I shook his arm, but he didn't move. Then I saw the lights on the Santa face. They weren't flickering randomly anymore. They were blinking in a pattern, spelling out something. HELP. We dragged Dad inside and locked the doors. He didn't speak for the rest of the night, just sat in his chair, staring at nothing. I told Mom what I saw, but she didn't believe me. "You're just tired," she said, pacing the kitchen. We're all tired, but I wasn't tired. I was terrified. The next morning, Maddie showed up at our door. "You need to leave," she said, glancing over her shoulder like someone might be watching. "What are you talking about?" Mom asked. "The lights," Maddie whispered. "They're not decorations. They're signals. They keep it away." "Keep what away?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she handed me a string of lights, old and tangled, with bulbs that looked like they hadn't worked in years. "Hang these up," she said. "Don't let them go out." No matter what, that night, the lights in the house started flickering again. I plugged in the string Maddie gave us, wrapping it around the living room. The bulbs didn't light up, but I left them anyway. Around midnight, the power went out. The house went dark, except for the glow of the candles lining the walkway. And that's when I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow. Something moved past the window, tall and thin, with long arms that brushed the ground. It stopped in front of the house, staring at the door. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its body illuminated by the flickering candles. Then it knocked. The next thing I remember is waking up on the couch, the morning light streaming through the windows. The power was back, and the lights were on, but the candles were gone. So was Maddie. We never saw her again. We moved out of Pine Hollow that spring, but I'll never forget that Christmas. Sometimes I think about the lights, how they flickered like they were alive, warning us of something we couldn't see. And sometimes I think about Maddie. I wonder if she knew the truth. And I wonder if she's still out there, somewhere, keeping the lights on. I don't know why I bought it. The ornament was ugly. Old. The kind of thing you'd find in your grandma's attic and wonder why she'd ever kept it. It was a glass sphere about the size of a baseball, with red and green paint flaking off the surface. There was a single black line circling it, like a crack that had been fused shut. It wasn't even for sale, not really. I found it at a flea market while I was digging through a box of Christmas decorations. The woman running the booth looked nervous when I pulled it out. "That one's not part of the lot," she said, wringing her hands. I asked her why not. "It's just not," she stammered. "I'll sell it to you for $1, but you should know it's bad luck." I laughed. "Bad luck? Why?" She wouldn't answer. It was Christmas Eve when I finally hung the ornament on the tree. My girlfriend, Kelly, hated it. "Why would you buy something like that?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I thought it was cool," I said. "It's creepy," she shot back. "It looks wrong." She wasn't wrong. The ornament did look wrong. The more I stared at it, the more I noticed things that didn't make sense. The way the light from the tree seemed to disappear inside it, swallowed by that black line. The way it swayed gently, even though there was no draft in the room. But I didn't say anything. That night, Kelly and I stayed up late, drinking wine and watching Home Alone. Around midnight, she went to bed, leaving me on the couch with the glow of the tree. I was just about to doze off when I heard a faint tink-tink sound, like glass tapping against glass. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. The ornament was moving, not swaying, spinning. Slowly at first, then faster, the black line turning into a blur. "Kelly," I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I got up and reached for the ornament, but before I could touch it, it stopped, dead still, like it had never moved at all. I told myself it was the wine, or the heat from the lights, or anything but what it really was. And then I saw the crack. It wasn't a crack anymore. It was an opening. I woke up to the sound of Kelly screaming. I ran upstairs, heart pounding, and found her in the bedroom, standing by the window. She was pointing outside, her face pale. "Look," she whispered. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. There were footprints in the snow. Dozens of them, circling the house, too small to belong to an adult. "Kids?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Maybe someone's playing a prank?" Kelly shook her head. "They weren't there earlier," she said. "And look," she pointed to the front step. The footprints stopped there, right in front of the door. I checked the locks twice before going back to bed, but neither of us slept. Around a.m., the tink-tink sound started again. Kelly grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. We crept downstairs together, the floorboards groaning under our feet. The tree was dark. The lights had gone out, but the ornament was glowing faintly, a sickly red light leaking from the crack. And then it spoke. Not with words, with whispers, low and soft, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. "Do you hear that?" Kelly asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. The whispers grew louder, faster, overlapping each other until they turned into a shriek. The ornament shattered. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers came back, louder this time, filling the room like a swarm of insects. Kelly screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. We ran outside, the cold biting at our skin. The snow was untouched. No footprints. No sign of anyone or anything. But when I turned back to look at the house, I saw them. Figures standing in the windows. Small, pale, and staring at us with eyes that burned like the light from the ornament. We didn't go back inside. By morning, the house was empty. The tree was gone. The furniture was gone. Even the walls were bare, stripped of paint and wallpaper. The only thing left was the ornament, sitting in the middle of the living room, perfectly whole. We moved out that same day, leaving everything behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see the crack. It's not an ornament anymore. It's something else. And it's waiting.